Hello and welcome to episode 53 of Bicycle Touring Talk. I am George Schlacek,
the one and only,
telling you the story of my bicycle tour across Central America. In the previous episode, I had made it to Bocas del Toro, where I got sick. After sleeping in puddles for 2 nights because my tent wasn't rainproof, I had spent another night in a dry room before returning to the mainland on the ferry. Then I had spent a night in a budget hotel in Almirante, a major port town. The next morning I felt almost back to normal. After breakfast in Almirante, I decided that I was good for the trip to Chiriqui Grande, the next town on my route, still located on the Caribbean coast, about 75 kilometers away. The ride started off easy, but then there were hills. Climbing them was tougher than I remembered, probably in part because I hadn't fully recovered from my sickness. Especially the steeper sections seemed to take its toll on my legs. No matter how much I tried to get into a rhythm, it just wasn't happening. What to do? Well, all it took to get past the sticking point was for me to adjust my attitude. It meant slowing down, lowering my expectations. Essentially, it didn't really matter what time I'd get to Chiriqui Grande, as long as it wasn't in the dark. The trick was to gear down and look down while climbing, as well as taking extra breaks. There were a few hills that had me pull the brakes so I wouldn't roll backwards. Those parts were the longest because I had to push the bike. Thankfully, there were some roadside stops along the way where I could grab cold drinks and snacks. One of those stops was a family-run business, and they were very curious about my tour. I was even asked what my motivation was and if I was running away from something. I'm not sure if they were satisfied when I told them that curiosity was my main drive. Thankfully, there was no rain at all that day. It was hot and sunny, which was not exactly making it easier to ride, but definitely more pleasant. The landscape was quite wild and beautiful, with occasional great views of the ocean. Car traffic was light. A good day. I reached Chiriqui Grande late in the afternoon and found a hostel almost right away, but decided to go further into town toward the shore. There were several older hotels, but they all looked pretty run down. Locals recommended I'd go back to the hostel I had passed because that was the best in town. Dinner was outside, almost right in front of that hostel. You've got to love those typical Central American family businesses because they take pride in what they do. I had chicken with rice, beans, and vegetables. Once checked into my room at the hostel, I went for a short walk back to the shore. Chiriqui Grande was definitely not a tourist destination, but could be very charming, if not for the amount of garbage people left around, which kind of made me sad. This town is a major terminal for the Trans-Panamanian pipeline. The next day I was up early. I had about 115 kilometers ahead of me and knew right off the bat that they weren't going to be easy. The city of David was basically on the Pacific Ocean. To get there, I had to climb mountains for about half the distance until I reached the Fortuna Dam and the forest reserve. Starting out, I was fully aware that the climb would probably take all morning, but the descent on the other side would make up for it. On one steep section, a car passed me. The passenger side window rolled down and a guy yelled, "You're crazy!" at me in English. Next thing I passed by a pig in someone's yard, and it too seemed to think I was crazy. To be perfectly honest, I had underestimated Fortuna Road, as locals call it. The hills were steeper than expected and it was very curvy. There were also very few places to stop. To top things off, rain started again and turned into a foggy, constant drizzle the higher up I got. It was a tough go. Eventually the rain stopped and the sun even came out of the clouds, but the climbing continued even after I had made it up to the hydroelectric reservoir and the store where I had a quick break for a much needed snack. How much longer was I gonna have to climb? When I asked at the store, it seemed like it wasn't too much longer, but the going was slow. It was mid-afternoon when I passed a familiar spot. There was the pathway to the Lost and Found hostel that Jessica and I had stayed at little over a year before. The surroundings were beautiful with jungle all around and spectacular waterfalls. But I was still going uphill. Finally, I reached the village of Valle de la Mina. It was definitely later in the day than I had hoped, but I was completely out of energy, and there was this restaurant that I already knew from before. Jessica and I had explored Valle de la Mina the previous year and enjoyed a great lunch here. The same lady was still running the place, and I got served an excellent meal once again for a fair price. The climb was going to be only a short distance more, I was told. After the next curve, it was going to be all downhill. The road was dry now and in decent shape. It meant probably the longest and fastest descent I have ever experienced. I made only one more stop at a store in Gualaca, where I met a bunch of American tourists whose tour bus had stopped on the way to Boquete, a very popular town in the mountains that I have yet to visit. At that point, I would have loved to take some photos, but my camera was fogging up from the inside and eventually quit altogether. Days of rain had taken their toll. Was this it for my camera? The ride down to the Pan American Highway was fast. By the time I reached it though, the sun was setting. There was no way I could reach David before dark, but this 4-lane expressway had a very wide shoulder. Traffic was light and it felt pretty safe to ride with my flashing lights on. Entering David, Panama's second largest city, was a bit of an ordeal. It was dark and I needed a place to stay that wasn't the Hilton, but quiet and clean. I would take it for 2 nights because there was no way I could just carry on the next morning. First of all, I was exhausted. Then I had panniers full of smelly, wet clothes, and finally I wanted to make sure my camera was okay. After spending an hour or so crisscrossing the city in the dark, someone guided me toward the Hostal Pension Costa Rica. This was a very basic place, but it had internet, air conditioning, and a private bathroom, all for a bargain rate. Before going to bed, I took out the camera, removed the lens and the battery, and left it out, hoping it would dry out. I was way beyond tired that night. It almost felt like I was getting sick again, but I fell asleep before I could even worry about it. March 14th was my so-called rest day. I got my laundry done and walked all over town. The camera worked again. Mostly it was probably the battery that had died, but vapor inside the camera body had got me worried. Another thing I had to do was a bit of bicycle maintenance. The chain was getting rusty because of too much rain, and the bottom bracket actually had developed a bit of play. Now I was grateful for having hauled the wrenches for this adjustment with me the entire way, because it made life easier now. It also felt really good to have my laundry clean and dry again at the end of the day. When I tried to use the internet, I had a surprise. It was ridiculously slow here. Eventually I got bumped off and my computer connected to some public government Wi-Fi for everyone. I had to type in some information in order to get an hour worth of free internet. Once that was done, it actually worked better than the hostel network. I wanted to check online for what was ahead of me. There was a beach called Las Lajas, which basically means the slabs. There was apparently a beach resort along with some budget accommodations, including camping. This time, I wasn't the least bit worried about camping because the Pacific side of Panama is very dry in March. Rain wasn't going to be an issue. The climate was completely different here. The next day I left David relatively early. Las Lajas was about 87 kilometers away, so a pretty good ride, especially in the heat. The first 10 kilometers or so, I had to backtrack to the intersection of Fortuna Road, the one that had brought me down from the mountains 2 days before. At that intersection, something really funny happened. I spotted a hitchhiker at the side of the road near a gas station. Curious as I was, I pulled up to him and asked him where he was headed. It turned out he was going to Panama City. His idea was to land a job on a freighter and sail to Europe that way. I was intrigued. This sounded like a kind of adventure to put on my bucket list. It turned out that his name was Cale and he was from Illinois. Cale had slept in an abandoned building right across the road from the gas station. We hit it off talking about our travel adventures, and then it dawned on me. I had met this guy before. He was actually an old friend I had met in Veracruz on my very first bike tour 3 years before. We had met at a parade during the carnival and spent the night partying with locals at the beach in Boca del Rio. It had taken each of us a 15-minute conversation to realize that we had met before. I later kept up with Cale when he actually made it to Spain and stayed there for months. The rest of the ride to Las Lajas was quite easy compared to what I'd been through. The road was flat and there was no rain in sight. The only challenges were the heat and toward the end of the day, a flat tire. I threw in the spare tube after inspecting the tire but not finding anything. At the soonest opportunity in the village of Las Lajas, I got another spare tube. Before getting to the beach of Las Lajas, I had to pass through the village. I had a meal there and then moved on to the beach area a few kilometers further down. Las Lajas was a very quiet beach. But unfortunately, there was no lack of human evidence. Why do people toss garbage on a beach? And why wouldn't business owners try to do their part to keep their premises and the beach clean? I found an inexpensive spot to camp for just one night. It was okay, but there was no one else here besides some chickens and a few geese who were apparently quite interested in my tent and the bike. I love walking on the beach, so this wasn't too bad after all. I went swimming and then went along the beach to see if there was anything going on besides low and high tide. The whole area was surprisingly deserted, which was almost unbelievable with such a beautiful beach. In the campground next to mine, I saw one tent. To my surprise, it was a couple I had met in Bocas del Toro. Jacqueline and Claude from France. I ended up sitting with them around the fire for a bit and found out that they were in a bit of trouble. Having traveled to Panama on a one-way ticket without enough funds for an extended stay, they had counted on their teaching jobs to support them. Those jobs had apparently been cancelled. They were still in good spirits though, trying to find other work in Panama. But internet access was complicated here. You had to go to the Las Lajas beach resort, a place that pampered foreign tourists, and order a meal or a beer so they'd let you sit in their lobby and use the Wi-Fi, they told me. They told me that for now they were just hanging out here, getting a lift to the store in the village once each day with a campground owner. After sunset, I went to the resort myself, laptop in hand. Besides some not-so-great restaurants with expensive menus, this was the only place to go on this beach. I spent a couple of hours as I met some Canadians who were enjoying beer after beer at the bar. When I told them I was on a bicycle trip, they didn't seem to believe me. Overall, Playa Las Lajas was disappointing. But since Bocas del Toro, I had people rave about Santa Catalina, and that was actually not very far away. First, however, I had to go to the town of Sonå, and that was a 110-kilometer journey. The next day started off with another flat tire, the same one that had let me down the previous day. This time I really spent extra time examining the inside of the tire and found a tiny piece of glass. It was impossible to patch the tube right away because the wind didn't allow me to locate the puncture. I would do it in a room in Sonå. Soon I said goodbye to the geese and the bossy rooster that had woken me up at 6 a.m. and got on my way. I bought a gallon of water in the village of Las Lajas and then hit the Pan American Highway for a stretch before diverting onto secondary Route 5. The rest of the day was quite tough. The heat was extreme and the road had a lot more hills than I had bargained for. I got to Sonå just before sunset. At first it seemed that there was no hotel in this town, but then someone guided me toward a place that was renting bungalows. Of course, those were longer-term rentals and they were outside my budget. But the actual hotel was right on the main drag, except that it wasn't marked and no one was there. I was told that I had to come back at 7 p.m. because that's when the guy in charge was going to show up for work. I decided to use the extra time to go for supper, which was great. A local man asked if I would mind sharing the table, and of course I didn't mind at all. I learned very little about the town and a whole lot about Santa Catalina, one of Panama's prime beach locations. It was a surfer's paradise and a fishing village that had expanded along the coast far beyond its original area, but without really spoiling the character. There were no fancy resorts, but lots of backpackers' hostels and budget-friendly restaurants. After our conversation, my new friend insisted that my meal was on him. So I thanked him and walked back toward the bungalows to secure a room. Along the way, I passed a store which had ice cream cups. They were the same kind I had had in Bocas del Toro before I got sick. Since I was much better now, I decided to go for it and get one. It was only 50 cents, vanilla with some chocolate chips in it. Pretty sweet. The hotel turned out to be a decent choice once I was checked in, which was a bit of an ordeal of going back and forth because on the first attempt I was given some keys that didn't work. This isn't exactly uncommon with Central American budget hotels, as I had already found out. Only for this one I had to walk halfway across town to pick up another key. Once in the room, my computer was even picking up free Wi-Fi from the government of Panama public network. The bathroom was down the hall. There was only a fan for cooling and the curtains didn't really keep the street light out. But I was tired enough and fell asleep fast without even remembering the punctured tube. Well, I'll leave it here. Next week you'll find out what Santa Catalina was like, as well as the ride there. I can assure you that there were plenty of challenges and surprises, and I'll hope you'll join me. And you can subscribe. Well, I'll leave it here.